Page 268. Pearson shook his head. Later, when all this is over, he said intensely, I can't think of anything else until this thing is settled. For the first time since this morning's events, which had erupted so explosively in the lab, David Coleman found himself wondering about Pearson and what the older man was feeling. There had been no argument about the validity of Coleman's statements concerning the sensitization test, and Pearson's silence on the subject seemed a tacit admission that his younger colleague was better informed than himself, at any rate in this area. Coleman thought it must be a bitter thing to face, and for the first time he felt a stirring of sympathy for the other man. Pearson stopped drumming and slammed his hand hard on the table. For Pete's sake, he said, why don't they call? Is there any news from pathology? Dr. Charles Dernberger, scrubbed and waiting in a small operating room, which adjoined obstetrics, asked the question of the charge nurse who had entered. The girl shook her head. No, doctor. How close are we to being ready? The nurse filled 2 rubber hot water bottles and placed them beneath a blanket on the tiny operating table that was used for infants. She answered, just a few minutes more. An intern had joined Dernberger. The intern asked, do you intend to go ahead with an exchange transfusion even if you don't have the Coombs test result? Yes, Dernberger answered. We've lost enough time already, and I don't want to add to it. He considered, then went on. In any case, the anemia in the child now is sufficiently marked to justify a blood exchange even without the test. The nurse said, by the way, doctor, the baby's umbilical cord has been cut short. I wondered if you knew that. Yes, thank you, I did. To the intern, Dernberger explained, when we know in advance that an exchange transfusion will be necessary, we leave the umbilical cord long at birth. It makes a convenient point of connection. Unfortunately, in this case we didn't know, so the cord was cut. How will you proceed? The intern asked. I'll use a local anesthetic and cut down just above the umbilical vein. Turning back to the nurse, Dernberger asked, is the blood being warmed? She nodded. Yes, doctor. Dernberger told the intern, it's important to make sure the new blood is close to body temperature, otherwise it increases the danger of shock. in a separate compartment of his mind, Dornberger was aware that he was talking as much for his own benefit as for the instruction of the intern. Talking at least prevented him from thinking too deeply, and for the moment deep thinking was something Charles Dornberger wanted to avoid. Since he had left Pearson after the showdown in the lab, his own mind had been engaged in a torment of anxiety and recrimination. The fact that technically he himself was not to blame for what had happened seemed unimportant. It was his patient who was in jeopardy, his patient that might die because of the worst kind of medical negligence, and the ultimate responsibility was his alone. About to continue talking, Dornberger checked himself abruptly. Something was wrong. He had a feeling of dizziness. His head was throbbing, the room swirling. Momentarily he closed his eyes, then opened them. It was all right. Things were back in focus. The dizziness almost gone. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw they were trembling. He tried to control the movement and failed. The incubator containing the Alexander baby was being wheeled in. At the same moment he heard the intern ask, "Dr. Dornberger, are you all right?" It was on the edge of his tongue to answer yes. He knew that if he did, he could carry on, concealing what had happened, with no one but himself aware of it, and then perhaps, even at this late moment, by exercise of skill and judgment, he could save this child, salving, at least in some measure, his conscience and integrity. Then, in the same moment, he remembered all that he had said and believed over the years about old men clinging to power too long, the boast that when his own time came he would know it and make way, his conviction that he would never handle a case with his own facilities impaired. He thought of these things, then looked down at his shaking hands. "No," he said, "I don't think I'm all right." He paused, and, aware for the first time of a deep emotion which made it hard to control his voice, he asked, "Will someone please call Dr. O'Donnell? Tell him I'm unable to go on. I'd like him to take over." At that moment, in fact and in heart, Dr. Charles Dornberger retired from the practice of medicine. As the telephone bell rang, Pearson snatched the instrument from its cradle. Page 271. The final diagnosis, Артура Хейли.